More than a month after Nolan Wells was found dead in the water off Horn Island, two of the young men who were with him on July 4th went back. But this time, they didn't go alone. They returned with their attorneys. They traveled roughly 10 miles back across the Gulf of Mexico, stepped onto the same barrier island where Nolan spent his final known hours, and stayed there for about 3 hours. And according to their attorneys, they weren't there simply to remember him. They were there to study the island, the tides, the currents, the shoreline, the conditions Nolan may have encountered that afternoon, and one of their attorneys brought a photographer. Now, before we go any further, welcome back if you've been following the Nolan Wells case with us. And if you're new here, I'm glad you're here. This channel follows active investigations by separating what is documented from what is alleged, what witnesses say from what investigators have confirmed, and what we know from what we simply don't know yet. So, if you want these updates without the rumors being passed off as facts, subscribe and stay with us. Because today, we're looking at something that happened on August 7th that changes the way this case needs to be looked at. Not because it proves that anyone did anything wrong. It doesn't. No one has been charged. No one has been arrested. No one has been officially named a suspect. But because the people who were with Nolan during his final known hours have now gone back to the very place where those hours ended, and they went back with lawyers, that raises a question. Why now? Because more than a month after Nolan's death, the official answer to the most basic question in this case still hasn't been released. How did an 18-year-old who went to Horn Island with friends end up dead in the Gulf of Mexico? Mississippi's official autopsy has been completed. The results remain sealed pending review by a grand jury. The toxicology results have not been publicly released, and the family is still waiting for an answer.
As District Attorney for the 19th Circuit Court District of Mississippi, I want to talk directly to the people of Jackson County. Our community is grieving the tremendous loss of Nolan Wells, who is loved and treasured by everyone. Nolan's family deserves answers, and our community deserves answers. Every death in the county, except those of natural causes and non-criminal car wrecks, are presented to your grand jury. I understand the public's urgency to know what happened to Nolan, but we are not taking time for time's sake. We are taking the time required to complete the work this investigation demands. Since Nolan was reported missing, local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies have worked around the clock investigating what happened to him.
But while everyone waits, the people who were there are doing something unusual. They're investigating the island themselves. And that's where this story gets much more complicated. Because there is one detail sitting underneath almost everything we've learned about July 4th. Nolan's group did not travel to Horn Island on one boat. They took 3. And one of the men whose family has now offered $50,000 for information wasn't even on the same boat as Nolan. That matters. Because when you hear the phrase, Nolan's friends left him behind, it sounds like one simple sequence. One boat, one group, one decision. But the available evidence paints a much more complicated picture, and somewhere inside that complexity is a 90-minute gap that investigators still have to explain. Let's go back to the beginning. According to GPS data obtained by CBS News from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the boat carrying Nolan Wells left the dock in Ocean Springs at approximately 9:56 a.m. By 11:14 a.m., it had reached Horn Island. It was the 4th of July. A group of young people had traveled to a remote barrier island to spend the holiday together. By all accounts, the day initially looked ordinary. Music, swimming, friends. The kind of summer afternoon that should have ended with everyone getting back on the boat and going home. But sometime around 3 p.m., the timeline changes. Witness accounts place Nolan's last confirmed sighting around that time. His friends later told investigators that Nolan had decided to stay behind because he had met a girl and intended to return with someone else. That explanation has been repeated publicly. But there is an enormous difference between saying someone chose to stay and being able to independently establish what happened to that person after everyone else left. And that's the problem. At 4:31 p.m., GPS data shows the boat leaving Horn Island. Nolan was not on board. So take a moment and look at those two times. Approximately 3 p.m., then 4:31 p.m., 91 minutes. More than an hour passed between the last confirmed sighting and the boat leaving without Nolan. And this wasn't a neighborhood park. Horn Island is a remote barrier island. The National Park Service describes the island as having no shelter, no facilities, and no communications. If you are there without a boat, your options are extremely limited. And according to the account given by Nolan's friends, he had voluntarily chosen to remain there. But there is another question that has never gone away. If Nolan intended to stay, why did he leave his phone behind? His phone remained on the boat. His parents later recovered it, and they have said they believe messages may have been deleted from it. Whether anything was actually deleted, and what those messages may have contained, is part of the ongoing investigation. What we know is simpler. Nolan was separated from his phone. He was separated from his friends, and the boat left without him. The GPS trail continued. The boat traveled back toward the mainland. It reached Fort Bayou at approximately 5:52 p.m. It returned to the dock around 6:06. Then it went back out again around 7:19. None of those movements explains what happened to Nolan during the missing portion of the timeline. And then there's another complication. The boat later experienced trouble. A call was placed to a private towing company because the vessel was taking on water. The call was made around 4 p.m., according to reporting. The dispatcher asked whether everyone was on board and in good health. The response was yes. But by that point, the central question becomes unavoidable. Was Nolan already off the boat when that answer was given? We don't know. And that's exactly the distinction this case requires. A question is not an accusation. A gap is not proof of wrongdoing. But a gap is still a gap. And this one matters. Because the public conversation has often reduced July 4th to one boat leaving Horn Island without Nolan. But the group had access to 3 boats. That changes the picture. Warren Hudson, one of the young men now represented by attorneys who have publicly defended the group, has said he wasn't on the boat Nolan arrived on. So when the public hears Nolan's friends, it can create the impression that everyone was together for the entire day. The available accounts don't support such a simple picture. There were multiple boats. Different people were aboard different vessels, and different accounts describe what happened after Nolan allegedly decided to remain on the island. That's important because the more complicated the logistics become, the more important independent evidence becomes. GPS, video, phone records, witness statements, timestamps, anything that can tell investigators not simply what someone remembers happening, but where people actually were. And now, there is new video. Recently surfaced footage reportedly recorded on Horn Island at approximately 11:17 a.m. on July 4th shows a boat called Mac Daddy in the background. TMZ reported that the boat appears similar to a vessel shown in another video recorded later that afternoon. That second video reportedly carries a 2:23 p.m. timestamp. And in that later footage, a young man wearing swim trunks resembling those Nolan had been photographed wearing earlier that day appears aboard a boat with other people. But stop there, because this is exactly where responsible reporting matters. Investigators have not publicly confirmed that the young man is Nolan. They have not publicly confirmed that the boat is connected to his disappearance, and the videos have not been presented as definitive proof of what happened. So, we're not going to turn a resemblance into a fact. But the footage matters because it gives investigators another potential timestamp, another visual reference, another piece that can be compared against GPS data and witness accounts. And that is how a real timeline is built, not from one dramatic photograph, not from one person's theory, piece by piece, timestamp by timestamp. Which brings us to another document that has received far less attention than it deserves. The United Cajun Navy, the volunteer search and rescue organization that assisted during the search for Nolan, recently released a 22-page analytical report examining the available evidence. The report used material including GPS coordinates, photographs, videos, and witness information submitted by members of the public. And the authors were careful about what they were and were not claiming. They did not say they had solved Nolan's death. They did not accuse his friends. They did not assign criminal responsibility. Instead, they identified what they described as a material gap in the timeline. The period between Nolan's last independently corroborated sighting and the departure of the boat at approximately 4:31 p.m. In other words, the report isn't telling you what happened inside that gap. It's telling you that the evidence currently available does not close it. That distinction is incredibly important, because once you understand that, you understand why this case remains unresolved. There are things we know. There are things witnesses say. There are things that can be supported by GPS. There are things captured on video. And then there is the space between them, the unknown. And until that space is filled, certainty is impossible. Now we can finally return to the question that started this entire video. Why did Warren Hudson and Jax Pitalo go back to Horn Island on August 7th? Their attorneys have an answer, and it's important to hear it. Attorney Tyler Cox said the purpose was partly to help attorney Edward Paltzik understand the physical environment. Paltzik had recently joined the legal team representing Hudson, Pitalo, and Morgan Seymour. According to the attorneys, Paltzik wanted to see the island for himself, not from a photograph, not from a satellite image, not from someone else's description. He wanted to stand there, see the shoreline, observe the water, understand the currents. And there is a particular area they focused on, an area Cox described as the washing machine, where opposing currents can collide and churn the water. Paltzik later described the water conditions he observed as resembling chocolate milk. He argued that the conditions appeared unsuitable for swimming and suggested that similar conditions could have existed when Nolan was there. But again, there is an important caveat. The water conditions observed on August 7th cannot automatically be assumed to be identical to those on July 4th. Weather changes, wind changes, tides change, currents change. So this is an argument that needs to be tested against historical conditions, not simply accepted because someone stood on the island and saw rough water. And the attorneys say there was another purpose for the trip, the emotional one. Cox described Hudson and Pitalo as being deeply affected by Nolan's death. He said Nolan was like a brother to them. He said they had been struggling emotionally for the past month, and he said the return to the island was difficult for them. That is their explanation, and it deserves to be presented. But there is another fact that also deserves to be presented. They didn't return alone. They returned with attorneys. They brought a photographer. And the trip happened at a time when their legal team was becoming increasingly active in defending them publicly. Those things can all be true at once. They can have been grieving, and they can have been gathering information. They can have wanted to remember Nolan, and they can have wanted to understand the physical evidence surrounding the island. Those possibilities don't cancel each other out, but they do explain why the trip has attracted so much attention. And now we're seeing two explanations begin to emerge. One focuses on the environment, the currents, the water, the possibility that Nolan entered the water and drowned. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind has publicly acknowledged that the currents around the barrier islands can be dangerous, and that drownings have occurred in the area. The other explanation comes from Nolan's family and their attorney. Ben Crump has pushed back against the idea that Nolan simply drowned. Nolan knew how to swim. He had taken swimming lessons. He was an athlete. He played football at Southwest Mississippi Community College. And his family has questioned why an 18-year-old who could swim would have ended up in those circumstances. But here's the problem. Neither side has the official answer. The state has not publicly released the cause of death. The grand jury has not yet reviewed the evidence publicly. And the independent autopsy did not solve the mystery either. Which brings us to the medical evidence. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office conducted the official autopsy on July 7th, one day after Nolan's body was recovered. That examination is complete, but the results remain sealed pending presentation to a grand jury. And as of the latest public updates, the toxicology findings have also not been publicly released. That means the public is still missing the medical conclusion that should form the foundation of this entire discussion. How did Nolan Wells die? The family therefore commissioned an independent autopsy. Dr. Roger Mitchell examined Nolan's body in Washington, D.C. His conclusion was not murder. It was not drowning. It was not accidental death. His conclusion was undetermined, pending further investigation. And the reason matters. Mitchell said the body had already undergone the state's initial autopsy. He identified limitations affecting his ability to independently evaluate certain structures, including internal neck structures. He said those limitations prevented him from fully evaluating the airway and lungs for findings relevant to determining whether drowning occurred. That's not proof of wrongdoing. It is not evidence that anyone intentionally concealed anything. Medical examiners routinely remove tissue or organs during forensic examinations when necessary, but it created a limitation for the second examination. And when a family is desperately trying to understand how their son died, even a medically routine procedure can create another unanswered question. Mitchell's report therefore did something important. It did not tell the family what happened, It told them what could no longer be determined with certainty. And that distinction matters, because the independent autopsy did not contradict the official autopsy. The official autopsy simply has not been made public. The independent autopsy says the available evidence was insufficient to determine the cause and manner of death. So right now, neither examination has provided the answer the family wants. And that brings us to something that should concern everyone following this case. When official information isn't available, people start filling the silence themselves. In early August, Mississippi Public Safety Commissioner Sean Tyndall warned the public about a toxicology report circulating online that appeared legitimate but was fabricated. It was not an authentic state toxicology report. No genuine toxicology findings had been released publicly. That's an important warning, because there is a huge difference between investigating a case and manufacturing an answer. And this is precisely why we're going to keep making the distinction here. If an official document hasn't been released, we won't pretend it has. If a witness makes an allegation, we'll call it an allegation. If a video appears to show Nolan, we'll say investigators haven't confirmed it. And if we don't know something, we'll say we don't know. Because Nolan's death is not a fictional mystery where we get to invent the missing pieces. There is a family waiting for those pieces to be found. But while the medical evidence remains sealed, something else has been happening in public. Money has started pouring into the case. At Nolan's funeral on July 20th, Reverend Al Sharpton pledged $50,000 for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Tyler Perry then pledged another $50,000. Former NFL player Terrell Owens later added $25,000. Media mogul Byron Allen separately donated $100,000 to the family's GoFundMe. The family's fundraising campaign grew dramatically beyond its original target. And then another $50,000 offer appeared, this time from Dr. Benjamin Hudson, the father of Warren Hudson. Hudson said he wanted information to come forward and said his family had faced thousands of death threats. So now there are reward offers coming from people on opposite sides of the public battle surrounding this case. And that is not the only money involved. A separate fundraiser was created to support the legal defense of the young men being represented by Hudson, Patalo, and Seymour's attorneys. By early August, that fundraiser had reportedly surpassed $128,000 toward a $200,000 goal. So think about what has happened. One side is raising money to help find answers about Nolan's death. Another is raising money to defend young men who have not been charged with a crime. Both say they want the truth. Both say they have been treated unfairly, and both are now surrounded by lawyers. Which brings us to the next development. The attorneys representing Hudson, Patalo, and Seymour have said they are reviewing media and social media coverage for statements they believe are defamatory. At least one attorney connected to the broader circle around Nolan's friends has also reportedly sent a cease and desist letter to an online creator. Again, none of this establishes guilt or innocence. It establishes something else. The battle over this case is no longer happening only inside an investigation. It's happening in courtrooms, in legal letters, in fundraising campaigns, on social media, and in the court of public opinion. And the people at the center of it are 18 and 19-year-old young men who have not been charged with a crime. That's why the language surrounding this case matters. Calling someone a suspect is not the same as saying they were present. Calling something suspicious is not the same as proving criminal conduct. And saying something remains unexplained is not the same as saying we know what happened. Those distinctions are everything. Because while all of this was happening, something happened to Nolan's mother that is almost impossible to separate from the larger story. In early August, Christine Wansley learned that someone had filed a professional misconduct complaint against her nursing license with the Mississippi Board of Nursing. Her attorney, Ben Crump, characterized the complaint as an attempt to intimidate her. The complaint was later closed without discipline. But consider the timing. A mother loses her 18-year-old son. She publicly asks questions about how he died. She hires an attorney. She commissions an independent autopsy. And then a complaint is filed against her professional license. Whatever the motivation behind that complaint, the case was ultimately closed without discipline. And it did not answer the question Christine has been asking since July 4th. What happened to her son? Strip away the lawyers. Strip away the reward money. Strip away the competing fundraisers. Strip away the social media arguments. Strip away the photographs. Strip away the theories. What remains? An 18-year-old young man went to Horn Island for the 4th of July. He was seen there. His friends eventually left. He did not leave with them. His phone remained behind. More than an hour passed between his last confirmed sighting and the boat's departure. His body was recovered from the water 2 days later. His official autopsy is complete. Its findings remain sealed. The independent autopsy concluded that his cause and manner of death were undetermined. And now, more than a month later, 2 of the friends who were there have returned to the island with their attorneys. That doesn't prove anything, but it tells us something important about the state of the case. There are still questions serious enough that people involved are trying to answer them themselves. And the most important question remains untouched. What happened during those 91 minutes? Because that's where the story keeps returning. Not to the reward money, not to the lawyers, not to the internet, not even to the island itself. To that window of time, approximately 3 p.m. to 4:31 p.m., the last confirmed sighting, then the boat leaves, and Nolan is gone. There are witnesses who have reportedly described seeing Nolan later. There is video that may or may not show him. There are GPS records. There are multiple boats. There is a phone that stayed behind. There are competing accounts. There is an independent autopsy that could not determine the cause of death. There is an official autopsy whose findings the public still hasn't seen. And there is a grand jury that has not yet reviewed the evidence publicly. Those aren't theories. Those are the pieces. The job now is determining which pieces fit and which don't. So let's return one final time to August 7th. Warren Hudson and Jack Spitalo traveled back to Horn Island with members of their legal team. They stood on the same shoreline. They examined the water. They studied the currents. They took photographs. Their attorneys said they wanted to understand the physical environment and help build a clearer picture of what Nolan may have experienced. That is their explanation. And they have every right to investigate on behalf of their clients. But the timing inevitably raises questions, because this wasn't happening in a vacuum. It came after the independent autopsy, after the 22-page United Cajun Navy report, after new video renewed questions about the timeline, after their attorneys began pushing back against what they say are defamatory accusations, and while the official autopsy remains sealed. So perhaps the most important question isn't, does this prove the friends did something? It doesn't. The better question is, why does this case still require so many different groups to investigate the same afternoon? Law enforcement is investigating. Nolan's family has its own legal and investigative team. And now the friends have their own attorneys conducting their own examination of the island. 3 groups, 1 island, 1 afternoon, 1 dead 18-year-old, and 1 timeline that still doesn't completely close. As of now, there are no charges against Nolan Wells' friends. There are no arrests. There is no publicly identified suspect. There is no publicly released official cause of death. The state autopsy has been completed, but its findings remain sealed pending grand jury review. The independent autopsy remains undetermined. The toxicology results have not been publicly released, and the grand jury has not yet publicly reviewed the evidence. So nobody watching this case should pretend the conclusion has already been reached. It hasn't. The investigation is still active, and that is exactly why the next development matters. Because the next piece of evidence could change the way we understand everything that came before it. A phone record, a video, a witness, a GPS point, a forensic result, a grand jury presentation. Any one of those could close part of the gap, or make it bigger. And until that happens, we should resist the temptation to fill the silence ourselves. Because Nolan deserves something better than an internet verdict. His family deserves something better than theories, and the people who were with him deserve something better than being declared guilty or innocent by strangers before the evidence has been fully examined. The evidence needs to speak. Christine Wansley has asked essentially the same question since the beginning. What happened to her son? It's a simple question, but more than a month later, the answer is still buried somewhere inside an incomplete timeline. Sealed medical evidence, witness accounts, photographs, GPS records, phone data, and an island 10 miles from the Mississippi coast. And maybe that's why the return to Horn Island matters. Not because it proves what happened, but because it shows that even the people defending themselves in this case still believe there is something about that island that needs to be understood. The currents, the distances, the shoreline, the visibility, the conditions, the places people could have been, the places they could not have been, the details that only make sense when you're actually standing there. And somewhere on that island is the last known chapter of Nolan Wells' life. The public doesn't know how that chapter ended. The family doesn't know. The grand jury hasn't heard the complete case. And until someone can account for those missing 91 minutes, everything else is still incomplete. The money, the lawyers, the videos, the competing investigations, the theories, all of it surrounds the same unanswered question. What happened to Nolan Wells between the last confirmed sighting and the moment his body was found in the Gulf of Mexico? That's the question we will continue following. And if you're new here, subscribe. Not because we're going to tell you what to believe, but because when the official records change, when the grand jury moves, when the autopsy findings become public, or when new evidence finally closes part of that timeline, you'll want to know what actually changed and what didn't. If you've been following this case from the beginning, thank you for staying with us. And if you're just finding this story now, you're coming into a case where the biggest questions are still unanswered. So tell me in the comments, what stands out to you most? The 91-minute gap, the 3 boats, the phone left behind, the conflicting accounts, or the decision to return to Horn Island with attorneys? Keep it factual, keep it respectful. And remember, an unanswered question is not automatically proof of wrongdoing. But an unanswered question is still worth asking. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He went to Horn Island with friends. He never came home. And more than a month later, his family is still waiting for the one thing no investigation can replace: an answer. We'll keep watching.